you ever found it difficult to put your designs into the game? Is it such a chore, a very tedious and time-consuming process? Well, it might be the right time to make some editor tools. I'm going to be showing you how to make some editor scripts. I feel like making these is a lot easier than most people think, but there isn't a good enough push for them, even though they can save so much time on development, so that you can focus on that level design of yours instead of doing the manual and intensive labor of putting the design in. There are actually two ways to draw UI into an editor script. For this video, I'm going to be using a UI toolkit that is written in C# to demonstrate a fast and easy way to make these scripts. So, suppose we need a whole pipe system for this game. So we have our pipes here, and we want to be able to kind of make pipes and extend it really easily. We can actually duplicate this with a cross and use Control to kind of hold it. Press this to kind of change it to a straight part, and we can still extend it. And if I were to make a rotate corner, I would press corner and I would rotate it to the right like this. So I can switch between parts. I could also make a tank if I wanted to. So we're going to try to make this system. So let's get started on the implementation. We have some basic stuff here. A pipe prefab that is supposed to connect to each other. Here we have our pipe script. And it's pretty simple. It just has a starting capacity, a maximum capacity for storing some sort of liquid. We have a property that you can get anywhere, and you can only set in the same class on private. And at the start of the game, we would set the capacity, and we have this function that you can use to add water or any kind of liquid, provided that we clamp it between the 0 and max capacity. And we've got the base, just a cube, and also a head, which I've put a pipe corner prefab here. So we have a bunch of different selection of pipes. We have the corners, we have the intersections, we have the input-output, the straights, and we have a little tank that we can kind of use. And we've also got some bunch of materials set up here. And the idea is when I want to extend this pipe network, I want to press Control D to duplicate it. That, and I can drag it with Control. I then replace the pipe corner with the prefab that I want. So in this case, I want it to be straight. So let's make it straight, like that corner and like that. So let's try to automate this whole process using an editor tool. So to make a custom editor for this pipe script, we're first going to need to make an editor folder. We'll make a folder called editor. And this editor folder with the name editor is very special because any scripts that is inside it and is run, it will only exist in the editor. It will only run in a Unity editor. So we're going to make a class here. We're going to call it pipe editor. And we are going to extend editor. And we need to make a special custom attribute for this. So, to make this attribute, we make a square bracket. And you go custom editor, custom editor attribute. And it needs a type of whatever this script is called. So we've type here is pipe. So we're going to put in pipe. And we've got an editor going. Now to make this editor work with the UI toolkit, we're going to have to extend the function called create inspector GUI. Now we want to get rid of this bit. So if we just want to get this working, we want to make a new variable called visual element. I'll call this root equals new visual element. Now, if you're familiar with HTML, visual element is basically a div. It's pretty much empty container that you can pretty much do anything on. And we'll get to show you that later on. So right now, it's going to return root. So by default, this will just be an empty editor. If we actually run this now, So we've got SpyCrypt and it's empty, and you might notice that all our properties, all our capacity and everything is kind of missing. And ideally for this, we kind of want to keep that. So what we can do is we can draw the default inspector. Now the default inspector is drawn in ImGUI. We can kind of cheat a little bit by making an ImGUI container. So we're going to make an ImGUI container. We're going to call this the default inspector equals new ImGUI container. Now inside the ImGUI container, it's going to take in a Lambda function with no parameters. So we're going to take a Lambda function, which is how you make a Lambda function. And we need to be able to do something when the ImGUI needs to be called. So at this point, we're going to do draw default inspector. We want to have the default inspector added to the root, like so. You can see that, hey, our stuff is back. So to make a simple button, we just make button equals new button. Now, if you've played with UI a lot in Unity, you may have noticed that there's actually two types of button. But since we're using UI Toolkit, in this case, we want to use Unity Engine.UI elements. So make sure that we're using Unity Engine.UI elements and not Unity Engine.UI. So we've got our button. We set the name of the button by doing button.text equals, we're going to call it simple button. And we've got our button right here. So we need to add this button to our visual element root. So we do it like this. And we want the button right after the default, like all the inspector properties. So let's do it afterwards like that. And if we go back to Unity, we can see that our simple button's right here. And it doesn't really do anything right now. So let's make it do something. We have to make a Lambda function the same way we do for the ImGUI container. So we do the parentheses. And let's just debug.log for now. Button clicked. Now, if we press the button, we actually get a debug.log. Now, you don't actually have to make a Lambda function. You can actually make an empty function of called anything. And we can actually instead just pass the function name and do our debug.log here. This will execute the same way. But I'm going to keep it to Lambda function because it's nice and short. Now, right now, the button feels a bit claustrophobic, all cramped in here with this max capacity thing. So let's give it a bit more room. Now, first of all, we can actually have a much more simple way of writing this. And we can do this in a fashion called an object initializer from C#. So instead of doing that thing, we can actually make a new button and use curly braces instead with a semicolon at the end. And we can do text equals simple button. And what's really useful is with this is that if you need to set multiple things, like for example, background color or whatever, or anything, you can kind of just add on top of it. So in this case, I'll be adding style. And we're going to add a bit of margin to the top. And if you have been using CSS, you will feel right at home because pretty much everything here is very similar to CSS. And let's add 10 pixels. Go back to Unity. And you can see that, okay, I've got a bit of space. Now, so we're going to start by being able to rotate the object 90 degrees every time without having to mess around with all the numbers and whatnot. So to do that, I'm going to begin with a function. I'm going to call this function rotate. So, and I'm going to have a parameter with the amount of degrees that we want to rotate it by. So we want to get the object. So we have our pipe editor, and we want to be able to kind of get this pipe somehow. To do that, we're going to first store it in a variable, and we have to get serialized object dot target object, and we're going to need to cast it to pipe like this, and now we have our pipe. So using that pipe, we can actually rotate it. So I'm going to go pipe.transform.rotate, and we're going to rotate by 90 degrees, or actually I'm going to just put in degrees in this case for this function. And there we go. We should be able to kind of rotate this. So if we're going to add a callback to this function, we are going to add the parentheses, and we're going to just make it call rotate, and we're just going to rotate this by 90 degrees. And that should do it. If I press this button, it'll rotate the object by 90 degrees. Now I actually want to just rotate the head instead of the entire model. So instead of doing the transform.rotate, I'm going to go pipe.transform.find head, and if I rotate, it will rotate the head instead. Now that we have like rotate 90 degrees working, it's actually pretty easy to just copy this bit, have another bit, and rotate -90 to the other direction. And while we're at it, let's do a rotate opposite, so 180 degrees. And we gotta remember to add all these buttons. We have all these buttons, which I should actually name them. All right, so now we can rotate left, rotate right, and we can opposite it if we need to. All right, cool. Now I can actually organize this better, because right now it just looks like 3 buttons. I think ideally, let's make it so that you can actually have left, middle, right. Let's do that. Now this is where the div, or visual element in this case, comes in handy. We're gonna make an empty visual element. I'm gonna call this rotate buttons actually, equals new visual elements. And we're gonna add some styling to this visual element. And same way you can actually do it with the buttons, we can actually do it for visual elements. So we're gonna make it so that the style, we have a flex direction. Now, again, if you play with CSS, you know what flex does. And we actually want the direction to be row. So this means that we want the items to be sorted in a row. So 1, 2, 3 kind of deal. If you want it to be column based, like what we actually have just now, you can just do .column. But we'll do row for this one. We also have to remember to add the buttons into the rotate buttons visual element. So instead of adding all this to the root, we'll add the rotate buttons. We have to make sure to add the rotate buttons to the root. Move this up orderly. We've got our buttons nicely ordered. Now they're kind of off-centered, so if we want to keep it all nice and centered, we just do justify content, and we do justify dot center, and there we go. We have our buttons thing, and we can rotate right. I actually wanted to may have opposite in the middle maybe, so we can do that. We make sure that the right button opposite like that, and I think I would like to have this. It kind of looks nice. So we have this now, which is kind of looking pretty good. So now that we have rotation going, we want to kind of have it so that we can kind of like swap in these parts with the ones that we have over here. We can make buttons for those. So I'm gonna make a visual element called part buttons, equals new visual element. Now I kind of want the same style and everything as before for the buttons. Now we're gonna make a couple of buttons here to start with. We're gonna make the straight pipe button, so straight part button. All right, so we have all these buttons. We have to add them to the visual element above. And finally, we want to add the part buttons all the way at the bottom, right after rotate close. We have all these buttons now. We actually want to implement the behavior for them. So I'm going to make a function right here. We're going to call it set model. And we're going to take an asset path as our parameter. And the idea is that for each of this button, we're going to give it an asset path from our folder. So I'm going to call set model, and actually it needs to be a lambda function. And we're going to set the asset path to whatever the asset is over here. So for the straight one, under assets, prefabs, pipe straight. So actually I can just copy path and copy over here. And we want to do the same for these. So to implement our set model, we have to turn this asset path into a sort of prefab. And to be able to load an asset path, we can use the asset database function called load asset app path. Now, it's a prefab, so we're expecting it to be a game object, and we're just going to put in the string into the asset path. And what we should be getting is a game object of that new model game object. Now, what we do is we have to instantiate that prefab since it's a prefab. Now, since we're doing this from the editor, we have to do something special. We have to call prefab utility function class and call the instantiate prefab function. And we're going to pass in the game object. I think I'll be calling a prefab at this point. And we're actually expecting a game object from that. We have this prefab, and we've instantiated this game object. We want to actually set it to the head. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the same thing I have as below. So I'm going to try to get the pipe. I'm going to try to find the head game object that we're going to replace. And the idea is we want to be able to parent this game object that we've just created in the scene into this head game object, which we have over here. We do game object transform.setParent. And we want to reference the head transform. And now this is very important. When we actually set it as a parent, we don't want to change the positions. We want to just directly parent it. We don't want Unity to kind of mess around with the positions to make it be in the same place. So we want to say false. We don't want our positions to change. We want to keep it as what it was in the prefab. We actually have our old pipe corner here, and we kind of want to remove it because we want to kind of replace it. So to do that, I'm just going to go through every children of the head and getting a child object, and I'm going to get rid of it. destroy. Now, game object. Now, in the Unity editor script, or in the Unity editor, if you're making a script of any kind, we actually need to call destroy immediate. You can't ever use destroy. All right, so with that, we should be able to click one of these pipes, and we've got our buttons over here, and we can actually click one of them, and we'll actually set whatever part we want. And we can actually rotate it as well. If we want to, rotate it around. Yes. We can actually organize these things a little better and put it into separate functions. And we can move all of this across. And then we return part buttons. We do the same thing for rotation. Now, we can actually clean this up a little bit so that we can actually just have the margin at the visual element. And we're actually going to add these buttons in. So we add create part buttons, and we add create rotate buttons. We can add some margin to the part buttons. So we have this row in. Now, from this point on, it should be really easy to add the buttons for the rest of the pipes. So we're going to go do that. So we have these buttons now that we can kind of switch between really nicely. Now we can actually make these buttons a whole lot nicer with minimal effort. So I'm going to start by adding a nice little background color. I'm going to go to the visual element of the part buttons, and I'm simply going to add a background color to them. New color, 0.3F. So I'm going to start by making it gray like that. We now see a gray background. Right now it's very, very tight, so we can give it a bit of padding to the top and the bottom. We're going to give it 5 actually, padding bottom. We have a bit more spacing over there. So really cool if we can have some rounded corners over here. So to do rounded corners, you just do border left radius, and I'm gonna just go with 5, and I want to do it for the top as well, so top and bottom we have our rounded corners. So let's bring over the styling towards the rotate buttons as well. Now we have our background right here. Now maybe we want to actually have labels, so if someone from the design team needs to be able to understand what these things do, because right now they just look like random buttons, we can actually add labels on top of them. So to do that, we're going to add over here root.add label, just like that. And we're going to have this rotation, and we're going to do the same thing up here, parts selection. We could have a bit of padding over here as well. And I reckon we would kind of turn this into a margin bottom instead. There we go. We have our part selection and we have rotation. We can actually have the label be bolded so it stands out more. To do that, we have Unity, style, font style and weight, and we do fold style dot bold. Same thing for this one as well. Style, font style bold. And maybe we can have a bit of margin at the bottom for the extra thing. And there we go. We have our categories, essentially. Now, there are actually a few different types of editor scripts. The one we just made is a custom editor that we've attached to a game object. Custom editors also work on scriptable objects. But you can also make a completely new window for all your needs. If you made a custom class that represents a data structure, like maybe a graph or an inventory system, you can also make it easier to customize them in the inspector by using a custom property drawer. For example, Unity uses a custom property drawer to make it easier for everyone to edit a list. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing what you make.